afternoon, everybody. Hi, my friends in Mauritius, but also in the rest of Africa. Hi, Ivan, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's good to be here.
So you are not in Africa as we speak, yeah? You are in France.
That is correct. Lockdown, you know.
But summer in France, summer and sunny, and heat wave on the way.
I'm sorry for the people who are in South Africa or Mauritius.
So we are currently in our winter period.
I know.
Ivan Cornet, great to have you. Obviously, we've known each other for, well, I'm just thinking probably for 6-7 years.
Something
We've
like that,
crossed
yeah.
paths in a number of countries, specifically in West Africa. You normally based in Abidjan since 2012, if I'm not mistaken-ish.
Right.
You used to be in London, and currently you're in France because you were in France when they started locking down a couple of months ago. But I'm sure you would be on your way back to Abidjan before the end of the year. And
To Africa, at least.
and there's election also happening as well in Cote d'Ivoire.
We can talk about that.
So Ivan, I'm going to let you go through your presentation, which is charting a new course 2020, specifically talking about Francophone Africa. And then after your presentation, we're going to come back with the questions and answers. Yeah, it's all yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks, Kevin, for this opportunity. It's, as I mentioned, it's good to be here and to discuss a little bit the situation and the development in Francophone Africa. I have lived and worked in 4 continents and spent the past 10 years focusing on the African markets, including, as you mentioned, 6 years based in Abidjan from 2012 to 2018, with many trips and projects initiated and completed in the West African region. With this experience, I thought it would be interesting in this discussion to look back at the development of the Francophone African markets, in particular Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, what happened over the past 10 years and what could the next 10 years look like. Reaching the emerging market status has been a recurrent objective raised by most of the African governments. To date, out of the 54 African countries, I have counted 37 which have in the last decade launched some sort of plan to be positioned as an emerging country in the midterm. It is also the case for Francophone countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, which came out in 2012 out of 2 decades of civil unrest. Alassane Ouattara, the president of Cote d'Ivoire, quickly after his first election and the end of the civil conflict that followed it, indicated, and I quote, Cote d'Ivoire will be an emerging market in 2020. A similar plan has been enacted by the current Senegalese president, Macky Sall, with the Plan Sénégal Émergent, the Emerging Senegal Plan, which set out the date for 2035. Traditionally, when we think of criteria to assess whether a market or a country is emerging, we think of the economic aspects. And so we can actually start with that. If we look at the chart on the left of your screen, we see that GDP growth rate from 2010 up to the forecast of 2021 for the 3 major economies except Ghana in the West African region, i.e. Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal. So except for the blip of the 2010-2011 crisis, Cote d'Ivoire economy grew at an average rate of 8%. Same for Senegal at 6%. And we see that the situation is very different for Nigeria. An economy which is massively linked to the oil price and with a poor industry diversification. So we see that Nigeria took a massive hit in 2015 and 2016, then a slow recovery until the current COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF is expecting Nigeria to be in recession this year, but in the long run, we have an average GDP growth rate for Nigeria of 2%, which is actually quite low for an emerging country. Most interestingly now, on the right side of your screen, when we look at the GDP per capita, which takes into account the gross population, the population growth between 2010 and 2018, we know that we have a growth for Cote d'Ivoire of 34%, 19% for Senegal, but unfortunately a contraction of 11% for Nigerians. So a question that can be asked is, so why does Goldman Sachs include Nigeria and not Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal in the so-called next 11, the 11 countries like Indonesia or Egypt that after the BRICS will challenge the G7 countries in the 21st century? Very simple explanation, I think, mainly because of the size of the country. We have 196 million people in Nigeria for $397 billion economy. And when you compare it to Senegal with 16 million people and $24 billion US dollar economy, it makes a big difference. So I understand that in those circumstances, size matters, but is it enough to be named an emerging country? It actually raised the question of the definition of emerging markets. How can a country be named emerging when its population has become poorer over the years? Rather than looking solely at the economic aspect of it, an African think tank, the Observatoire pour l'émergence en Afrique, the Observatory for Emergence in Africa, OBIMA, has actually set up an index of emergence, which includes, of course, the economic aspect with GDP growth, business and regulatory reforms, infrastructure development, etc., but also the political, human development, and societal aspects. On your slide, you can see the definition they gave to emergence as a process of sustained economic transformation resulting in social and human performance and taking place in a stable political and institutional context and ensuring its sustainability. So we have, in addition to the economic aspect, we have the political criteria, which include democratic stability, corruption level, security, good management of the state. We have a human development. Of course, we think about education, employment rates, literacy rate, equal opportunity between men and women, and societal. The criteria include the healthcare expenses as a percentage of GDP, life expectancy, access to water and electricity. That index has been published for the first time in 2017. This think tank identified in Africa 11 countries which can be named as emerging. Mauritius has the best score, followed of course by the usual South Africa and Morocco, but we can also find among those countries Rwanda. The only West African country identified in the index as an emerging country is Ghana, despite a weaker score on the economic and societal aspects. And we see that the better placed for the three countries that we're currently looking at is Senegal. But Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria score quite poorly. So the question now is, what's left from the 2012 quote from Alassane Ouattara, Cote d'Ivoire will be an emerging country by 2020. Ouattara himself sang another tune in 2018, indicating that it may be challenging to reach that status in 2020. And more recently, the Minister of Planning and Development of Cote d'Ivoire declared that if we are not an emerging country by 2020, we may reach it by 2025 or 2030. At least we are now pre-emerging because Cote d'Ivoire has all the features of an emerging market. There have indeed been some major accomplishment over the past decade in Cote d'Ivoire in terms of reforms. We can see the World Bank doing business ranking, improving. Some infrastructure has been built or rehabilitated. Access to water and healthcare improved dramatically. And more recently, I understand that 80% of the Ivorian population should have an access to electricity by the end of the year. As we've seen in the 2017 OBIMA index, Cote d'Ivoire still scores very poorly on the human development aspect, with poverty and literacy rate only slightly better than when President Ouattara took office. And this is evidenced by the UNDP Human Development Index, where Cote d'Ivoire ranked 165th over 189 in 2019. The numbers on your screen is from the 2018, so a slight improvement, but it's still in the third tier countries with very low human development. And for information, Nigeria is ranked 158 and Senegal 166, so also very poorly. The best African country is obviously Mauritius, ranked 66. So what are the challenges for the decade to come? In the short term, of course, the impact of COVID-19 will be partly felt, and more partly for Cote d'Ivoire, a presidential election, you mentioned it, Kevin, is scheduled for 31st of October this year. I'm sure we can talk about both aspects, the COVID-19 and presidential election, in our follow-up discussion. For information, Macky Sall was in Senegal re-elected early 2019. In the mid to long term, major challenges need to be resolved in Francophone Africa to be called an emerging countries. First of all, a more inclusive growth. We've seen that despite an increase of 34% of the GDP per capita, the poverty rate has only slightly improved, with almost half of the Ivorian population still living in poverty. And an additional focus should be a growth by the private sector rather than by investment through the public sector. I think this will be even more crucial as the state will be in the future limited in its debt raising exercise on the capital market due to current debt level, which of course is unfortunately higher than when Alassane Ouattara took office, and the additional funding which will be required to manage the economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. Kevin, I think that's it for me. I think I've tried to keep the 10 minutes time frame.
Fantastic.
For you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ivan. I wanted to start with, obviously, when we talk about Francophone West Africa,
yeah,
we typically talk about two countries being Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal.
That's correct.
Any reasons why we sort of omit to talk about, the other countries, whether it's Burkina or Mali? Are they irrelevant in one way or the other, or is it, we just can't be bothered to look at other markets, that we're so comfortable at the two?
No, I do think that, of course, there is not only, and you know that better than me, I mean, in Africa, there is more than one size fit all or one country fit all. The other countries are as important, but when you look at the map of Africa, we usually look at the larger economies and in Francophone Africa, or the more mature markets. And in Francophone Africa, Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire are those countries. But it would require actually an additional session if we want to look at Burkina Faso or Mali, which has its own opportunities and unfortunately also challenges.
Sure. So let's stick to Cote d'Ivoire. Yeah. You've talked about elections at the end of the year, October. We're currently in the COVID crisis. The current president, I think he's currently on his second mandate already. So did he announce that he was not going to stand up as for a third mandate? So what's the current situation now? Yeah, are they going to postpone the elections?
So you know that 2020 is a big election year in Africa. We have votes scheduled not only in Cote d'Ivoire, but also in several other African countries, including Ghana, just name it, Burkina Faso. And election in Africa, in particular presidential election, are pivotal moments in most African countries. The October elections in Cote d'Ivoire is proving to be challenging. Cote d'Ivoire never had a peaceful transition of regime since its independence in 1960. The current president was first elected in 2010, which triggers an open conflict ending in 2011. He has been re-elected for second and final term per the constitution in 2015. Although there's been rumors that he might run for a third term, President Ouattara said that he will not seek a third term and back his prime minister, Amadou Gon Coulibaly, who's interestingly currently being treated in France for a heart problem. The election is expected to be highly competitive. The 2010 and 2015 political allies are not renewing this alliance. Henri Conan-Bédier, which has been president from 1993 and to 1999, is also running. So there's been fear since the end of 2019, actually, of a repeat of the 2010-2011 civil conflict. Today, I think a rerun of this crisis appears unlikely. However, I think there are several factors that increase the probability of a turbulent election. Among those factors, I mean, we can name regional and identity-based divisions, which has not been resolved over the last 8 years, incomplete disarmament program, and we have other legacies also from 2011 conflict, which include a series of military mutinies in 2018. So there's been a discussion of possible postponement of the election due to the COVID pandemic, but this seems currently unlikely and being disregarded expressly by the government. So I think the current months are going to be crucial to see how the situation will evolve. This election is, of course, particularly important for Cote d'Ivoire, but also for the whole West African region, I think.
Sure. You've mentioned the Conan-Bédier, but you haven't spoken about Gbagbo and Soros. Are they out of the scene or are they still there?
No, they're still pretty much there, but the situation is a bit different for those two candidates. The first one is that they are not in country. As you know, Gbagbo has been trial in front of the Hague tribunal court, and for the moment is still in Belgium. And Soro is in exile in France for the moment, and is trying to manage his presence, I would say, through to some partners in country. But it's very difficult, of course, to run for president when you're not in country.
Sure. But Gbagbo's wife is back in country, yeah, for the last year or two. So yeah, she must, yeah. So it'll be interesting to watch what's gonna happen.
It'll be very interesting, I think.
Yeah. Would you say on that note, on that political front, that Senegal seems a more politically stable-ish?
I think Senegal has been much more stable. I mean, Senegal went through 11 presidential elections since its independence, and most of them have been very, very stable, at least very recently. And we've seen in 2009 actually a change of regime, a peaceful change of regime. Of course, there's been intervention from major international donors for the election to be peaceful, but that has been the case. And the latest presidential election, early 2019, with the re-election of Macky Sall was very peaceful. And that's of course, one of the biggest advantage that we have as investors or operators when we look at Senegal, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Couple of months ago, before the COVID crisis, Macron, I think, was in West Africa, was it in Cote d'Ivoire, and
yep.
And he spoke about the legacy currency CFA, the current currency, that they should they should rebrand the currency. So can you give us a flavor of the CFA, just sort of a brief history? And what do you think the future is going to be all?
Sure. In terms of background, as you say, I mean, Francophone West Africa, through its regional monetary union, in French is called the UMOA, shares a common currency, the CFA francs, which is pegged at a fixed rate with the euro, which makes it a very stable currency. Just in terms of history, the latest devaluation of the CFA francs was in 1994, so that's 26 years ago. And you also know that the ECOWAS countries, including the UMOA countries, but also the Nigeria, Ghana, and Guinea planned earlier in 2019 to launch a regional currency with the name of ECO. This has been simultaneous almost in December 2019 to the joint statement that you just mentioned, made by the French and the Ivorian president, suggesting first some amendment and some adjustment to the framework of the existing UMOA, with a change of the name of the CFA francs into ECO. There's been, and that was long requested by the African countries, there's been some structural changes. But all in all, the free convertibility of the CFA francs at a fixed rate with the euros remain. The introduction of the new ECO currency, basically by the 8 UMOA member states, as it currently stands, appears more to be a change of name more than really an introduction of new currency. The issue we have is that...
So it will still be linked to the euro?
That is correct. There are certain conditions attached to it, which basically attach the French state guarantee, including a certain amount of international currency, let's say that, but it's still linked to the euro, and the free convertibility is still there. The problem we're having now is that this announcement of the French and the Ivorian president has attracted a lot of criticism from the other ECOWAS members, including Nigeria and Ghana, because it seems to challenge plans that has been set up and decided to launch an ECOWAS, a regional currency with the same name. And quite interestingly, President Buhari of Nigeria just tweeted as recently as yesterday that unilateral adoption of the ECO by the UMOA countries might actually risk a dislocation of the ECOWAS bloc, which makes it really interesting, the challenge that we will have to have an actual ECOWAS a currency, common currency. First of all, the UMOA ECO plan was expected to move ahead in July this year, in 2020, but several hurdles, and just to name the most important one is the global disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, basically postponed the adoption of the UMOA ECO plan. I'm assuming realistically that the establishment of a broader monetary union at the ECOWAS level is likely to advance in incremental steps, with countries joining if and when they basically are ready.
So it's interesting you said the president of Nigeria, President Buhari, he tweeted, so he's at par with, or trying to be at par with President Trump, who's
I'm
who
not
tweets
commenting on this.
more often in the day than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about the economy. Yep. In Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, what's coming out of that COVID crisis? Yep. Obviously, when you look at Cote d'Ivoire, I mean, they've dealt with bigger crises. Yep. I mean, they've dealt with, civil war. They've dealt with the country being locked down because of last from 2000-ish in that last decade. And then also it's a region, for example, which in 2012-13, probably when you moved to Cote d'Ivoire back then, we're dealing with Ebola crisis out of Sierra Leone.
Yep.
So a nation or nations that have dealt with crisis, how are they dealing economically today with this biggest pandemic crisis ever that the world has ever witnessed?
I think first of all, on the health side, I think Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire and most of West African countries have each reported very few cases and victim of COVID-19, especially if you compare that with Europe and the US. And I don't think it's appropriate to debate the possible reason behind these numbers. I do think, especially talking to people on the ground, that there are valid arguments to challenge their accuracy. On the economic side, the African government, including in Francophone Africa, has been mainly focusing on the economic aspects and impact of the pandemic. And just for example, Cote d'Ivoire has, with the support of the international donors such as the European Union, the IMF, the World Bank, has announced a major economic, social, and humanitarian support plan of 1.7 thousand billion CFA francs. So it looks like a lot of money, but it's actually only 5% of the GDP of Cote d'Ivoire. When you look at Europe or the US, where there are plans of over 20% of GDP, it gives you a sense of the size of the support plan. I think it's too early. We're still in the health crisis. I think it's too early to assess the economic impact, I think, of the coronavirus in Francophone Africa and Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal. It's uneven to date. Some part of the economy seems to be actually on course, with market, businesses, construction sites running. There's been a slowdown, of course, through most value chains. Investment and management decisions are on hold, particularly when they entail actually foreign investors are facing their own difficult times in their own countries. Public sector and regulatory supervision are slower than expected, and sometimes they're entirely suspended due to lack of capacity and or direction. And supply chain are clearly affected by global disturbance of the transport industry, but also with borders that are still closed for all the countries. As in any countries, liquidity is, of course, an issue for most businesses. But what's actually interesting when you are talking to local business is that often the impact and the effects of the COVID-19 are often denied. I think most of the business are eager to maintain some sort of reassuring public image. That I think what we can say on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy in those countries, I think.
Would you mind going back to that slide? I think it was your first slide where you showed basically the growth that one. Yeah, very often we, which is interesting because very often we, focus on GDP growth, but we never talk about growth per capita. And clearly here you can see, for example, on your table on the right-hand side, 34% in Cote d'Ivoire and 19% in Senegal, and obviously Nigeria, we know for the reasons, etc., very slow growth, GDP, but increasing growth in the population. Yeah. So Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal clearly in the whole of Africa are ranking probably in the top 10, basically, or top 5. do you see a lot of the investment over the last 5 years in Cote d'Ivoire has been public infrastructure, for example?
That is correct.
Even in Senegal as well, in Dakar or outside Dakar, you're talking about the development. We're going to talk about real estate, the development of the new city, Diamniadio, as an example. And then lately, Ivan, we've heard a number of players, including President Macron, again, including Merkel, Chancellor, including the Pope of the Vatican, and even China talking about potentially writing off debt. How indebted are these countries, the two countries, and anything that you can share from your perspective about potential debt written off?
Sure. First of all, I think most, and that's also an interesting point with the ECO and the change of currency, is that most of the debt has been raised on the international capital market in foreign currency, in euros, because the capital market, the regional capital market, it's too small to raise substantial amount of money. So the debt is still, I would say, acceptable. Especially when you look at the debt level of European countries, but we are in a very different economic situation. So, I know, for example, that the debt for Cote d'Ivoire is about 50% GDP, which is low and lower to the requirement framework that is imposed on the UMOA for the stability of the CFA francs, which is 70%. So it's still lower, but the debt level has been raising quite substantially over the last few years because debt is so cheap in the international market for those countries that there's been a lot of money which has been raised. And again, I think that's the point I was raising, is that there is, despite the fact that the amount that's been injected in the local economies by the state is low comparing to Europe or the US, more money will need to be raised to support the economies and the countries following the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's something to look at.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ivan, let's turn to a sector that you well versed into, which is real estate.
Like you,
you've advised a lot of clients of yours in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, but also neighboring countries as well. And you've even helped clients doing transactions further up north in North Africa, being Morocco. I guess we'll have to invite you back to do another presentation about real estate specifically. But if you could give us your thoughts about how have you seen the evolution of real estate since you've been there, since 2012, and where do you see the future post-COVID in terms of real estate investments? Sure.
As you know, I mean, you were one of the players in the 2010, 2020 decade. Most international real estate investors focused on English-speaking Africa. I mean, we've seen large developments in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya. And during that period, French-speaking Africa was mostly overlooked. You had only a few international players exploring those countries, naming Actis, RMB Westport, G5 Properties, and with the recent withdrawal of RMB Westport and G5 Properties, none have actually completed a development project to date in Francophone Africa, except for Actis, which is currently completing, as we speak, the Douala Grand Mall in Cameroon. So despite a few notable exceptions, such as the redevelopment of the Tour First in Abidjan by the French Groupe Duval, most real estate investment have been and still are completed by private and institutional but local players, including insurance companies, pension funds. But we are seeing now new players, very different from the English-speaking international players that we used to see 10 years ago. And those are Chinese and Moroccan firms, often because they have a very strong political backing. And they're entering the market with large projects, such as, the development of the Diamniadio new city in Senegal, or the Abidjan Cocody Bay in Cote d'Ivoire. So these are very different players that what we used to see. With regards to COVID-19, I think, again, as for the economy, I think it's too early to see the major impact, except for what we see, a slowdown of some real estate development. Real estate investors and developers in Francophone Africa, and especially in Cote d'Ivoire, have not modified their mid to long-term projections to date. But I mean, when you look at Francophone Africa, and it's very similar to other African markets, we see some impact already now across the asset classes. Hospitality, of course, has been the worst hit, with hotel closed for a few months. We've seen previous trends, such as the alternative working solutions or online retail shopping, which should be reinforced. But I don't think that we will see some transformative effects on traditional office or retail sector, as we see anywhere else in more mature markets like in the US or in Europe. One point on the residential sector, which I think is important, is much less reliant on foreign investors. So I don't think it will be affected by the current context, as there is as much needs now that's been in pre-COVID-19. So I think it doesn't change anything much on the residential sector.
I mean, in those two countries as well, I mean, you also have a regional market for residential people from neighboring countries who come to Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal.
These are seen more, yeah, exactly. These are more seen as more advanced sometimes, especially for Senegal, more stable countries. So you have a lot of high net worth individuals for Mali, for example, investing in Senegal, or for Burkina Faso, investing in Cote d'Ivoire. Absolutely.
So I've got two more questions, very easy questions.
Sure.
Yep. If you had to choose in your region in West Africa, Francophone Africa, if you had to choose one country to put money in, let's say if you had to choose one country, which first one that would come top of your mind?
You know that I'm not going to answer this question. Huh? What I'm going to say is that I do think seriously now that each country has its own opportunities and interests, which sometimes are in very different asset classes or very different industry. And as I mentioned, I mean, clearly Senegal is much more stable, but we've seen also that the growth rate in Senegal is much lower than what we see in Cote d'Ivoire. And we see also on another point that there's been some massive oil and gas exploration, very promising oil and gas exploration in Senegal. So all in all, I think we need to, and as any investors, operators, you need really to consider the plus and minus of each country, I think.
Sure. Okay. Hopefully you might answer the second one. No, you did answer the first one. The second one is, if you were to give an advice to somebody who would love to come and go on holiday in West Africa, Francophone, which one do you think they should pick?
Yeah, holiday, you mean?
As leisure.
It's leisure. I think Senegal is an obvious choice. Senegal is an obvious choice. It has a long history of welcoming international tourists, especially on European tourists, very similar to what's being done, by the way, by Mauritius. And Senegal also made it easy for international tourists to come through charter flights, in its country. I mean, visa process is very easy, unlike some other Francophone West African region. And to be honest, the weather is much better also in Senegal than elsewhere in Francophone Africa.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. As you know, I've got a sweet tooth for Senegal. Lovely place, nice weather, lovely people, great food, great music. It ticks pretty much all the boxes, if not all the boxes. Yeah. Ivan, that was great. I mean, we've already reached 45 minutes. Like I said to you, I think I will most likely come back to you where we could do another session a couple of months from now, specifically on real estate, because that's you've got so much knowledge about real estate and different real estate asset classes, etc. So we'll definitely come back to you. And thanks a lot for your time. And when are you planning to be back in Cote d'Ivoire post elections?
To be honest, it's a tough question. It's a very tough question. The first point is that the European Union needs to open its external borders. I'm not sure that it's going to be very soon. They're talking about the 1st of July, but depending on the situation in the other country in terms of pandemic, the EU doesn't want to import more cases of COVID-19 on its ground. So that's going to be the main criteria, to be honest. Of course, there's going to be the election in October, so going to follow that very closely with locally and see how things are evolving.
Sure, absolutely. Sounds like a crazy year. Wait and see, and hopefully things gonna be back to whatever normal means. Again, great to have you, Ivan.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot for your time, and speak to you soon, and keep well and enjoy summer sunny France.
Thank you very much for that. And
thank you, everybody.
You take care.